Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at creating a terrain in Houdini. We're going to be exporting that terrain out to Blender as a image file that Blender can import and read as a displacement map. We're then going to also be exporting splat maps from Houdini into Blender, which control texture variation and placement. And then we're going to be lighting and rendering the scene in Blender Cycles, and we're also going to take a look at how you can do that in Eevee. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright guys, so first of all we're going to start off with an empty Houdini file, so just hit File New or just open up New Instance of Houdini. So this isn't exactly a tutorial of how to use Houdini itself. I can link in the description to some videos from Side Effects for learning Houdini, but this tutorial we'll be doing is going over how you can create a very simple, easy terrain and export that out into any engine of your choice. So the first thing to do is to start off with creating a height field. So you can right click in your network view. You can type out the entire word height field, but what I like to do is just say HF. Houdini's case sensitive, so you can find, height field right there. Place that down. You notice the view's just covered with the height field, so if you press F, that focuses the view, and you have a height field. So in the height field, we can actually open that up and it'll create a height field property. Now that's the exact same as if you were to just create a empty geometry here and say HF, throw down a height field. It's the same process, but gets the job done. So we're not going to worry about any of these settings. Size, that's an important feature. So it's the size in meters, so 1,000 by 1,000, 1 kilometer. We'll leave it at that. So the main way to control Houdini's height fields is with noises. I'm going to do an HF noise. Place down the HF noise. Now take a view, and as you can see, alright, we've got a nice noise going on here. So when you're wanting to create noises, a good rule of thumb that I found is the amplitude. Well, let's just take a good look right here. So the amplitude, as you're increasing or decreasing the amplitude, that's basically the strength of the height. So the default's 500. The element size, that is how small or how large the details are. So let's say about 400, and let's go maybe about 550, something like that. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Maybe we'll go a little bit more, 440. Okay, so I'm trying to go for a little bit of a mountain scene here. Alright, so another thing to know about the height field noise is there's multiple noise types you can play around with. So you've got like a sine, 3D sine wave, you've got Perlin noise, that's like a standard simple noise you might see in other programs for creating basic terrains. Periodic Perlin, you get the picture, but we're using the sparse convolution, which I think is the best noise right out of the gate. You can combine and blend noises together, but that's not something that we're going to be doing in this video at least. So the next step for us to do is add in a road, which is the most important node that I would say for creating a believable terrain. So it might take a little bit of time to process. It depends usually on your CPU speed. The program is very CPU independent. Take a look here, and you're going to see it's going to change the display. It's going to create a shop material, and it's not going to look very nice. So if you come over to visualization and compute the range, you have the range here. So this goes basically from 0 to 1 or negative 69 to 92 point whatever it decides that the range is. You can delete these, you can move these around. It's really up to you. I don't tend to use these very much. They're just for visualization purposes. So there's a lot of settings here. There's actually like an hour, 2 hour long video that Side Effects went into on one of their SIGGRAPH talks, I believe, about all the features, and it's very in depth. Of course, I'm not going to go in all the features here. I just like to use the default features at the moment. So we're going to click freeze at frame, which freezes at frame 20. I think that's good enough. It's not too much simulation time. So hit that and you'll see down here, just cooking the terrain, going to frame 20. Give that a few seconds. Okay, so our bake has completed. It didn't take too long. Of course, it depends on the performance of your CPU. So you can see down here in the timeline or animation timeline, whatever you want to call it, that you've got these blue frames up to frame 20. If you don't see it, if your view is something like this, click this arrow here and that'll show up. I have a custom view, but if you use the default build view, then you've got it right there. Basically what I have for my custom view is I just have this as one thing, and then if you press P you can have the properties. So I find this is a lot more useful than having the properties as one window and then this at the bottom. But that's personal preference. So if you actually scroll through this, you won't see any difference because you're frozen at frame 20. But the nice thing about freezing at frame 20 is you're not caching all these frames that you don't need. So you uncheck this, that's frame 1. So as you could tell, the erode node erodes over time. And if you just go through, you can see quite a bit of erosion. Now I like that. I think that gives some character. If you compare the two, it looks a lot more realistic. If you keep running the simulation, it'll keep computing in the background, but you don't necessarily want that. It's wasting some RAM. It's going to store all the frames in your system RAM. So we're going to freeze it at frame 20. Alrighty, so now we have our terrain, but we still have this material, and I don't personally like it. I think it's hard to visualize how the terrain actually looks. So we are going to delete that, and the easiest way to delete that is with a attribute delete. So we're going to throw that down here, take a view, and it's under the detail attributes. It's the material, the shop material path. So now you can take a nice look and you can see all of that detail that we got. So this is a before and after. Kind of messy, but it's, you know, it's a noise, and then some realism here. So I would take this any day. This is starting to look like a mountain. Now, what I want to do is have a snowy mountain. So all this detail in here, all these little valley areas and rivers. What I could do is I could go into the erode, I could go into the advanced riverbed, riverbank. I could tweak all these variables, but it's going to be slumping above that anyways with the snow. So I'm not going to bother about that. Just want this to be a quick tutorial. So then next what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a mask by feature. So we can mask it where the slump is. So I'm going to start by inverting this because we do not want it at the tops, we want it at the bottoms. Delete this so that it's basically a constant. And then we'll just play around with some values here to get where we want. I think that that's good. So now we're going to be using what's called a height field slump, which is basically what I called a snow modifier. So you can instantly see, kind of hard to tell with the red, but that is where snow is building up. Decrease it a little bit or increase it, however that works. The more iterations you have, the more refined it is. So I'm going to decrease it a little bit. Alrighty, so now what I'm going to do so that I can see this a little bit better is put down an HF mask clear. So you can probably guess what that does. It clears the mask. And now if we take a look, beautiful snow. The nice thing about this is you can have this node selected. You can be viewing this snow here, and you could be playing around with this slump. So obviously you're going to want more than probably about 50. I think about 60 iterations is good. Spread rate, again, leave that at 1. And mask by feature, you can play around with this for how much snow you want. I want it pretty snowy, but not too much. So I think that's good. That kind of looks like we're at the top of a mountain here. And we got some peaks. Okay, so next up is, let's visualize that. Not that. HF visualize. So again, it's going to look terrible because we have to compute the range. So we compute the range here, and yeah, you can see you got yourself a nice mountain range. So now what we're going to do is we are going to output that. So high field output allows you to output as an image file. So the best way I found is to use an EXR file. I leave it at packed raster, RGBA, 32-bit floating point. The resolution you can choose. You can flip it, flop it. I leave it alone. So let's do something nice. 4096 by 4096. And we are going to choose height for red, green, blue, and nothing for alpha. And we're going to need to remap this between 0 and 1. Otherwise, the height will just, it will not work in Blender properly. And we do not want that. So now let's choose where to output this. We're going to output this into the project. So I just save this as simple terrain creation Houdini. We're going to create a new folder, texture folder. And we are going to call this an EXR. So we're going to call this simple terrain.exr accept and hit save to disk. Might take a few seconds. It's compositing. Okay, so I just went ahead and opened up the EXR file in Photoshop. So as you can see, it's been mapped correctly between 0 and 1. So the low values, those are the whites, and the dark values, those are the peaks. So you can see this is fairly dark, basically almost black, and here this is almost 100% white. So that has been mapped correctly between 0 and 1. Alright, in the next video we're going to be looking at importing this map correctly into Blender and setting it up so that it looks basically the exact same as the terrain in Houdini. Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at importing the EXR file that we created in the first tutorial from Houdini into Blender. We're then going to set that up using a displacement modifier and the subdivision surface modifier, and we're going to take a look at getting it ready for shading, and the next video we'll be importing splat maps. Alright, without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, we're going to start off with deleting everything in the default scene, and we're going to shift A, create a plane, press N to bring up the properties, and so the dimensions in Houdini for the height field was 1000 by 1000, and it was 151.048 tall. Now, we could technically scale that in Blender, but we would be dealing with some very large values. So if I scaled up by 1000, scaled up to 1000, as you can see it's clipping. You can go into the view and change the clipping settings. Now, one problem I've had with Blender, and I'm sure that this can be solved quite easily, but if you go to every other view that's a 3D view, you have to change the settings, and that can get a little bit tedious. So what we're going to do is we're just going to scale that back down to 1 by 1, actually 0.5. Now let's scale it up by 10. So we're going to do 10, and then the Z height is going to be, it's going to be a ratio, so it's going to be 1.51. So next what we're going to do is we're going to go into edit mode, press tab, right click, subdivide the mesh. We're going to change this to 100 subdivisions. Alright, we're going to go to the modifiers tab. We're going to set up a displace, new. You're going to want to change this to UV, and you're going to want to just name this terrain. And while we're naming that terrain, we might as well name the plane the object and the mesh. Okay, so if you go to the modifiers and you hit this button here, you can see the actual texture. So we are going to open that texture there. So that texture I have saved under tutorial series, textures, simpleterrain.exr. So we're going to import that in. And it might look like an absolute mess for you, and that is okay. So you want to change the color space to non-color, alpha to none. I don't know why, even though it's grayed out, sometimes it clips on the ends. Set that to none, uncheck alpha, and in mapping, we're not repeating this texture. This texture is just staying once. So we are going to do clip. I also forgot we're going to press Control A and apply the scale. Okay, now you're looking at that and you're going, wow, that's pretty small. Let's shade it smooth, by the way. So what you can do is you can scale it up here to that value, which was 1.51. So we could go 1.51. Or if you like to keep the scale a nice even number, you could just bump up the strength to 1.51. Okay, so now we have our terrain and it's looking pretty low resolution. So if we went into edit mode and we just kept subdividing it, that is an option, but you have no control over it. It's permanent, right? So I think this is fine. This is fine for my computer at least. So I'm going to turn this off, add a subdivision surface, move that above the displacement. I'm going to crank it up to 3 in the viewport and let's go 4 in the render. Now let's turn the displacement back on. Be prepared for a little bit of time to wait. Now, as you can see, it's a little slow on my computer, but you've got a lot more detail than if you turn that off. Now if you want some more viewport performance, if you come up to the properties for the viewport shading, turn off shadow and cavity. Specular lighting doesn't seem to hit the performance very well, and I prefer to leave it on just so you have a better view of what's going on. So the next thing to do, so you can get a nice preview going, is press Shift A, add in a camera. Make sure that's under your scene collection. Doesn't really matter at this point, but I like to keep it organized. Press Control-0 to go into the camera view. Grab ZZ to move backwards. Grab Z to move down. Move forward. If you double tap R, you get to some fine control mode. Now it's a little shaky, but if you hold Shift, it's very smooth. Okay, so I think that looks nice like that. So if you go into the camera tab and you go under composition guides and thirds, if you just line up these points with some points of interest, just really helps overall with your composition. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the shading tab, to world. Now I have this set up for an environment texture, but environment textures take a while to process and some video RAM to deal with, and we're not at the stage of rendering yet, so I'm going to import in a sky texture. Not import in, but create the node. So if you go back to the default and you go to, let's go to the rendered view. I'm in cycles right now. Okay, so we've got a sky. We don't have a lot of shadows going on, so let's create a sun. Press 1 on the number pad. Let's rotate it. 7 on the number pad. Let's rotate towards us this way a little bit, let's say. Now let's see how that looks. Okay, RZ. Let's control these shadows a little bit. I think something like that looks good for a preview. So let's just do a nice preview render. So 1920 by 1080. Let's do 50%. And I think 125 samples is good to go. I'm going to give that a render and we'll be back shortly. Okay, so the scene rendered out. It didn't take too long. It took about 13 seconds and just under half a gigabyte, or just over half a gigabyte of memory. So this is very low resolution. There's not a lot of detail going on, but you can see that there's some stepping going on here. the image. So we'll take a look at that in the next video and possibly re-export out the height field. It is a 32-bit floating point RGBA channel, so I'll have to take a look into that and see why that's happening. Guys, in this video we're going to be taking a look at fixing some of the issues with the mountain, specifically the stepping. So without further ado, let's get into it. So to start off with, I'm going to show you how you would fix one of these issues if you were using a texture that you got online or somewhere else. So if you come down to the sampling tab in the texture, which is a displacement texture, you can get to by clicking here. You can see you've got sampling and you've got filter type, eccentricity, and size. So if you increase the size to something, say 15, so you're losing some detail, but you're also losing that stepping. So if you set it to say something like 8, you're reducing that by quite a bit. You're also losing some of the detail. So we're just going to leave that at 1, but that is a good thing to know if you are going to fix an issue that you're come across from a different texture. So here I am in the Houdini file, and if you look very closely, I'll turn the grid off. If you look very closely, you can actually see that there is indeed some stepping here. That is because in the height field we set the resolution, the grid spacing to 2, which is about 2.5 million voxels, which sounds like a lot, but when you look at it, it's really not. So if we increase that value, or sorry, decrease that value to something like 0.5, okay, so you see we've got 8 million voxels. So everything has to recompute because we are increasing the amount of voxels. So the biggest thing that we're going to be increasing for performance is the height field erode. We need to change the smoothing for the height field erode. So if you go to the advanced tab and you enable post smooth, so once you increase the resolution, as you can see here, these little sliding trails, you can't really see that because of how low the resolution is, but once you hit reset simulation, that's going to resim all 20 frames, and you're going to see why we have this enabled in just a moment here. Simulation finished, and as you can see, we've got these lines coming down from the mountain. That's simulating weathering, such as rain and water sliding. So if you were to disable this post smooth, you can see that it is very harsh, way too harsh for my liking, and just enabling this post smooth is a great way to reduce that. You get a better look at it if you go to the attribute delete and enable and disable this post smooth. So I think it's honestly essential for when you're creating a terrain like this. So now if you take a look, you can see that we have our mountains set up. It's looking pretty nice here. Next, what we want to do is we want to just change this mask by feature for the slumping. So the reason that we're going to be changing that is the way that the slumping worked on the low resolution, it doesn't quite work with the high resolution. So I'm going to increase this mask slope angle up to around 60, go around there, and minimum slope angle, let's just bring it down about 27, 28. Okay, and this is fine like that. The reason is that we don't want sloping on the peaks. Around there, that's fine, because that's realistically where some snow would stick and stay. So if we bring back the slump and we clear the mask, you can see that there's quite a bit of snow here, but it looks very flat and kind of boring in my opinion. So there's a feature in the height field slump that I discovered. It's the granular. So when you first enable it, it's going to look terrible. It's just like white noise. But if you can control it properly, which I found a way to, it can look very nice, like some snow that's been settling on a mountain. So if you set the spread rate to 0.1, and let's up this to about 75. Now I think that looks pretty nice. I think it looks like some snow that's just settled on the mountain here. You can't really see like any valleys, but you can see all the peaks sticking out. The next thing to do is to go to the height field output and make sure that we're selecting the same texture as before. Accept, save that to disk. That's going to render out. Okay, Now we're going to go into Blender, and as you can see, the image hasn't changed, but once you hit this reload image here, you should see quite a significant difference. Alright, so let's see that. Okay, and boom. Now if you zoom in here, you can see that there's not a lot of resolution stepping that you can see. You can see that it's all basically independent of how high you have the resolution in Blender. So that concludes the third video of this tutorial series. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at creating splat maps in Houdini and exporting that out as a texture image to Blender to begin the texturing process in layers. Hey guys, in this video we're going to be taking a look at creating and exporting the alpha mask to use in Blender for texturing to blend between the two terrain types. Without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, what you're going to want to do is just erase the mask clear. That was just for visualization purposes. And to speed things up, for if you have to open up the file next time, you're going to want to drop down a file cache. I'm going to set the name to just %os.bgo.sc, which is the operating handle. So I'm going to change this to terrain output. I'm only going to save the current frame, and I'm going to save this to disk. Now once it's saved to disk, you want to hit load from disk and reload geometry, so that every time you open or close the file, you're just loading this file instead of calculating the entire height field. Now what you're going to want to do is drop down a height field mask by feature. And you're going to want to set the type to add, so you can add the existing map that we had back in the slump. Set the smooth radius to 1. You're going to want to invert this mask. You don't want to mask by slope, you're going to want to mask by the occlusion. Wait for that to calculate. Now basically what the occlusion does, if you look at the differences, the occlusion is in edges and shapes and curves like that. Basically think of it like ambient occlusion. So what you're going to want to do is I set the minimum amount to around 0.7. So that really builds up the snow there, even builds it around the peaks. I'll set the view distance for the quality down to 100. I don't know why, that just gave me a better result. And what I did was I dropped down another height field mask by feature. This one I set to add as well. And then what I did was I did not mask by the slope, I masked by the curvature. So I calculated the curvature. Now the curvature is a little different from ambient occlusion. I'll show you in a second here. Now the trick is to delete these two nodes here. Move this all the way across. So you have a gradient from basically from 0 to 1. Now if you look, that looks nice, but there's not a lot of detail. So I found a way to get to details, set the max curvature to a low value of like 0.2. Now if you look, we have these little seams and we have all of these peaks here. So the red, if you couldn't tell, will be snow, and the white will be the rock peeking out. The last thing you're going to want to do, drop down a height field output. This time you're going to want to set it to textures. So I set it to terrain_alpha.tga. It's a single channel image, it only needs to store black and white values. And it's fine to be a 16-bit floating point. Set that to 4K. Now for the red channel, the single channel, you want that to be the mask. You want to auto remap it between 0 and 1. Now hit save to disk. Now over in Blender, you want to make sure that you have your terrain selected. Another thing I should note that I did not notice in Blender 2.82, but I did in 2.83. So we have this file option here called half slope precision. So use 16 bits per channel to lower the memory usage during rendering. I'm assuming that's if you were to use a 32-bit file, which we're only using 16 bits anyways. So I just have this selected. I didn't notice any conceivable difference between the two. Now what you're going to do is go over to the shading tab, make sure your terrain's selected, and you're going to want to create a material. I'm going to call this terrain. Very creative. Now there's two ways that you can do this. I'm going to do it the way that's the easiest. What you want to do is start with two principled shaders. First one I'm going to set to black, second one I'm going to set to white. And you're going to want to put in a mix shader to mix between the two. Now for the factor, I'm going to put in an image texture. Can you guess which image it's going to be? If you guess the terrain alpha, you would be 100% correct. So it is not an sRGB color. You want it to set to non-color. It's just black and white. And let's preview this in Blender and see what we've got. Perfect. So you can see that you've got the peaks and the valleys. Black is rock, white is snow. And the nice thing about Houdini being procedural is you can always go back in Houdini and adjust the mask. But if you don't want to, if you're lazy, you'd always drop down a color ramp. Wait for that to calculate. And you can increase both values. You can adjust how you want them to be. You could also even lighten the values if it's too strong. It's completely up to you. So now I'm in Quixel Mixer and I'm just picking out my snow materials. So I'm actually going to pick, I think, 2 snow materials to start, and I'm going to blend between those two. So the first will be a fresh snow. You can see here. And the second will be a fresh windswept snow. So download settings that I use, it's 4K. You can of course use 2K if you're limited for bandwidth, or if you want to be insane, you can use 8K. And I use the offline metalness. Transmission, that might be useful. That might be useless, but we're going to take a look and see. So I'm going to download that. So one neat thing about Quixel Mixer, Quixel Bridge, is that you can actually export to Blender directly. So I have my blend file open. I am going to just click off of anything here, and I'm going to export to Blender at 4K with JPEG, which is the exact same download settings that I imported. So I'm just going to hit export. So now you can see in Blender that I have the fresh snow imported, and it's going to ironically freeze up my computer. Get it? Because it's snow. So you can see the material imported successfully. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it, I'm going to cut it from that material, and just quickly paste the material in and plugged it into the mix shader. So I'm going to play with the scale value. Make sure you set the mapping to point. It was at texture, and I set it to around 64. So you see that gives me quite a bit of detail. Now you can tell that it is tiling, so what we're going to do is we're going to choose another material from Bridge. So I chose a nice windswept snow, so we can layer the windswept snow with the fresh snow. So I'm going to export that to Blender. So I imported that texture set into Blender here. So we're going to copy the mix shader, or copy between these two snows. Now what I did was I dropped down a color ramp, and I set the value to around 0.4 and the black to around 0.8, and then imported a noise texture, set the scale around 40, detail around 10, up the roughness and the distortion. Basically what that creates is a little bit of variation between the two. And because you have two different snows, that means it's not going to look like the textures repeat. Now this one up here I hit to 64, I hit this one 64 as well, set that to point. Now if you look at the two textures combined, you'll see there's basically no noticeable seams. It all looks very different. And maybe asking now, what about the rock? Well, for that I have a good answer for you. Now the trick with rock and snow is not to use a straight rock, because I've done that before and that is a terrible mistake. It's very hard to blend between the two. So in this case, I'm going to use a snow-covered ground, so I get the best of both worlds. Because realistically, it wouldn't be just to have no snow on it, right? So now what I do here is I import in the rocky material, change this to point, and I set it to only around 32. I thought that 64 is just too high. So here's what it looks like on its own, and here's what it looks like with the material. So the rock might be fine on its own. So that's it on its own, and then this is just the snow. You can see that has a nice breakup. And next, what I did to give the mountains a little bit more variation is I went to the color ramp for the terrain alpha, and I bumped down the black level, included a gray so that I can control just how much detail is exactly showing there. And then what I did was I moved that into a mix RBG mode, and I turned that into overlay. And then what I had is a noise texture, 70 scale, 16 detail, no roughness or distortion, and I upped the white value just a bit, plumped that into the bottom socket, and if you see there, that just kind of breaks up the detail. Kind of looks like wind almost breaking it up, and together that gives you this effect. So if you look here, this is before. Just give it one moment. Very straight and to the point, very boring. And then this here kind of breaks up the texture a bit for you. And one thing I also did was added in a hue, saturation, and value node, because if you look at the material I selected here, you can see that there's a lot of green from grass, which is natural. However, I don't want it to be that green, so I'd bump down the saturation to 0.3, which just gives it this look. Together, that is the mountain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the World tab, and I'm going to choose an HDRI. Just load one in right here. So now my HDR is set up, and I've decided to tweak the hue, saturation, and value so that I can have more blue sky, more blue clouds showing, instead of the traditional value, which is a lot more basic. The thing you're going to want to do is delete the transmission textures. I couldn't end up getting those working, so I just deleted those from both snow sets. You want to go to your default view, and let's set up the render settings. So color management you can change after it's been rendered. That's dependent on your scene. Samples, I'm going to do 250, enable adaptive sampling. 6 light bounces is fine. Clamp 0 for direct light, 10 for indirect. And let's filter out some caustics. 32 pixels, that depends on your processor. And let's start the render. Okay, so this is how the render looked after I tweaked the view transform. You can see it's still fairly noisy at 250 samples. You may bump that up or just use denoising. So come over to the compositor tab. Got my denoising here to get rid of some of that noise. Also got a color balance, which I tweaked just to give some more blue, and a glare node, just to kind of give some more bright areas in there. And then some lens distortion, always lens distortion. And here are the values for each. Your color balance will vary as well as the glare, that depends on your scene.